All right, guys. So today I wanted to talk about construction of reality, but from a little bit of a different perspective than the academic article that I had. So I wrote down some notes um, so I could explain this to you guys in a little bit of a different perspective, kind of like without all the academic jargon, essentially. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm actually defining the ego. And the way that I define the ego is a little bit different. Okay. I define it as human patterns, perceptions, and behaviors. And of course, this is actually opposed to the traditional idea of the ego, which is related to the id, the ego, and the superego, as it was described by Sigmund Freud. But there's actually a very, very good reason for this, that I have things set up in this way. Okay. And it really has to do with the universal perceptual filter, or otherwise known as the UPL. Okay. This was how I described construction of reality, how I introduced the idea in the academic article I wrote, which I also posted on my YouTube. So if you haven't seen that, please go check it out. Okay. But the way this works, and this is what I have this model here for, is you actually start with the stimuli. Okay, this gets processed through your ego or your universal perceptual filter. Now, the terms are not necessarily interchangeable. And again, if you want to understand in depth what the universal perceptual filter actually is, you should go look at the other video that I have, which explains it from a more academic perspective. But for this case, we can understand it kind of as the filter that filters everything. It is a universal filter. It is the way that we process all stimuli. Okay. Then it goes through a process of categorization. Okay. It gets categorized, and then this feeds back into the ego. It feeds back into the universal perceptual filter, which confirms whatever biases that you have, whatever they are, whatever it is that exists. Okay. As it relates to developmental psychology, okay, it kind of works like this. So when at the moment of your birth, right, this is the start of your ego. This is the start of your universal perceptual filter. Okay, it goes to smelling the room, crying, being held, opening your eyes. Right, these are all experiences that you have that all induce the development of these categories. So from the moment that you were born, and there's studies that suggest that babies process things before they are born, but for the purpose of understanding this, we're just going to say at the moment of birth. Okay. So you have all of these experiences. These experiences are categorized in one way or another. Okay. And it all feeds back into each other to start developing the ego, the universal perceptual filter. Okay. So a more tame example of this, a smaller example of this would be if you believe that you're bad at math. Okay. You have failing a test in there, you have low grades in there, and then the cycle continues, so on and so forth, and it feeds into the belief that you are bad at math. Okay, so again, it is a generative feedback loop where you go from an experience, the stimuli, you to categorization of that stimuli, and whatever way that you categorize it feeds back into your original perception of whatever it is. Okay, language actually expands and categorizes more experiences. We put words to it. Okay, you go out and you see a dog for the first time. You say, "Mom, what is that?" And mom goes, "Well, that's a dog." And then you think every animal with four legs is a dog, common errors, okay? And then you eventually start to categorize the differences between dogs and cats and bears and so on and so forth, right? So, with the acquisition of language comes rapid expansion of your construction of reality. Okay, so the more language that you acquire, the easier it becomes to identify and categorize different things. And when you get abstract thinking, this modifies the categories. Now, a little bit of a side note here. I started building construction of reality based off of the ideas of Mark Ihala with psychedelic integration, Mind and Society by Lev Vygotsky, which is where he introduces the zone of proximal development. At least I believe he introduces it there. If not, at the very least, he goes more in depth in it. and scaffolding as well. And so this is actually crucial to how construction of reality works, right? And looking at the zone of proximal development through construction of reality, it kind of goes like this, right? You have a topic, there is a limit to how much you can do on your own, which is what this bar is here, right? And then with a teacher, you can gain a deeper understanding. And this is kind of how we acquire categories. Now, of course, you can acquire new categories on your own, which we'll get into a little bit later, I think. So we can acquire and create new categories either through the zone of proximal development or on our own. But it's important to understand just that this basic idea that you will always be able to create, you're always going to be creating new categories, and they're always going to be feeding back to your initial perception, okay, through the generative feedback loop. Now, this isn't always the case, and we'll get into that a little bit more closer to the end here. We need to understand that categories are always going to be an interconnected web. They're always going to be connected to each other one way or another, right? So you start thinking about animals, right? This is just your starting point, the starting point of a thought, okay? And then you start thinking about dolphins because you were thinking about animals, right? Then you start thinking about SeaWorld. Then you start thinking about the time that you went to SeaWorld with your parents and you had a really fun time, and then like it started raining and you were really sad that it was raining, right? And then your family started comforting you, so then you start thinking about your family, then you start thinking about your parents, okay, and then you start thinking about your friends and past experiences that you've had, and then you start thinking about video games, and you remember this one video game where you turned into a werewolf, Twilight Princess, I guess, and then that starts getting you back into animals, so you start thinking about wolves instead, and then so on and so forth, right? So that's just an example of how you can like chain together a bunch of thoughts, and these thoughts are always going to be chained together. And this is very well understood in cognitive psychology, that when you have an intense emotion, it is tied to an event in some way, and this is mostly how PTSD works, as far as I understand it. Okay, so it's important to remember that they are going to be interconnected, that it is always going to be that way. Okay, so you have the universal perceptual filter at the very top. It exists at the top of the hierarchy. Okay, and you categorize a bunch of events that are all connected in one way or another, and then they all feed back into your original perception. And I repeat this a lot every single time I go over this, because it's really important to remember that it is a generative feedback loop. You use the top of the hierarchy to generate new categories, and the new categories feed back into your original perception. Okay, it's always going in a loop. Okay, and this is where we get things like cognitive feedback loops from. Um, but of course, the logical implication of this, all right, is that there are cognitive distortions, right? And so I have a little bit of a description here for them in case you were unaware. But they are perceptions that are just not aligned with truth. They are distortions of reality, okay? Ways that you perceive things that aren't necessarily aligned with the way they actually are. So we can go back up to the I'm bad at math example, right? Let's say you believe you're bad at math because you failed the test and you have low grades, but every time you went in to take the test, you had like 2 hours of sleep, and this just gives you low grades. You say you're working while you're going to school and you're too tired and you're failing your test. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're bad at math. So that would be a cognitive distortion, right? Now, let's say you're bad at math and you actually do really well on your test, but you still believe that you're bad at math. Now, that would be even more of a cognitive distortion, and I believe this is the difference between positive and negative cognitive distortions as well. If it's a positive cognitive distortion, right, your logic is consistent with what your belief is. If it's a negative one, then it is inconsistent with what your belief is. Okay, so just something to think about there, right? So of course, if we have a cognitive distortion, right, that distortion would exist at the universal perceptual filter. So it would exist at the top of the hierarchy of categories, and would therefore affect every single category under it, right? So the processing of information would be fundamentally flawed, right? And so the higher up these distortions can exist in any place within the categories, and there are certain mindsets, right? And this is the point of this here. There are certain mindsets that you can have that will make you process information much differently than just being bad at math, right? Because being bad at math doesn't mean that you're bad at English, right? Although, if you did have that association, that would be another cognitive distortion, right? So the way that you perceive things is equivalent to your mindset, and your mindset is equivalent to a philosophy. Okay. And so the reason I point this out here is because when you address a philosophy that someone has about their life, you end up addressing the distortion. Now, this doesn't apply to irrational thoughts necessarily. Not exactly, like you can believe something, you can believe that what you're doing is irrational, but there is a cognitive distortion that is resulting from your mindset, the way that you see the world, the way that you perceive the world. Okay. And as an extension of this, I think we can actually redefine mental illness as construction of reality distortions or core distortions. You can think of it as like a distortion at the universal perceptual filter that affects every other aspect of your life. Okay. So not all cognitive distortions would exist at the universal perceptual filter, but the cognitive distortions that exist in the universal perceptual filter affect every single thought and every single thing that you categorize. Okay, that's essentially how it would work. And so, as a result, we can actually attempt to identify what the cognitive distortions are. And the way the cognitive distortions are currently explained is through things like catastrophization, through black and white thinking, things like that. Okay, and to me, this seems like a product of a philosophy. It doesn't necessarily explain the philosophy behind it, and the distortion would exist as the philosophy. I explained this a little bit in the last video I uploaded, where I was analyzing an academic article and relating it to construction of reality. And this is part of the reason why I'm doing this now, so I can expand on that idea a little bit, right? So if we can look at depression as nihilism, lack of purpose or goals, right? And this isn't going to be the case for everyone. Not everyone that is depressed is going to believe that life is meaningless, but they're either going to see that life is meaningless or they are going to see that they have no purpose or goals. And I do believe that you can identify someone that is depressed by these characteristics, right? If you have a purpose, if you have a goal that you are working towards, that you are actively working towards, you are much less likely to be depressed. And I do believe this is consistent with current research on happiness and depression. But someone can fact check me on that if that's not the case. But this is the point here, right? You can tie a philosophy to a mindset that someone has, and that philosophy, that mindset, would be the cognitive distortion, the core cognitive distortion that creates an effect on everything you do, right? So if you have no purpose, if you have no goals, you're not going to enjoy basic daily tasks. You're not going to see the point in getting up and taking a shower or brushing your teeth, because why would you if you have no purpose, right? If you have no goals, right? If you're not actively working towards them, right? And there are other things that factor into this, of course. But again, we are identifying the core distortion, what exists at the universal perceptual filter that is preventing someone from overcoming this depression, right? Because the way that mental illnesses are currently defined are through the symptoms. They are characterized through the symptoms. We'll get a little bit more into it in a second here. Another example would be anxiety, right? So a lot of people with anxiety catastrophize. I would go so far as to say everyone with anxiety catastrophizes, which is one of the cognitive distortions, right? But the philosophy behind this catastrophization would be an excessive control of the outcome, which would, of course, add a multiplier to your danger prediction. Okay, so you're going to be perceiving every situation as more dangerous than it actually is through the excessive rumination and trying to control the outcome of every situation. Okay, so of course, I have a little chart here to map it out, right? So this is kind of how you would address the cognitive distortion, right? If someone is depressed, you would allow them to see meaning in life. And seeing meaning in life would allow them to find their purpose. Now, they can see meaning in life and still be depressed, but they most likely would not have their purpose. Okay, and for anxiety, you find a way to release control, and then that neuroticism is now transferred into a balanced planning where you are able to plan for unexpected outcomes without excessive rumination and excessively trying to control every single outcome. Okay, understanding that you cannot control the outcome would reduce the levels of anxiety, hypothetically, right? So, and how this would kind of work too is you would have a your universal perceptual filter that has a cognitive distortion and whatever is existing within it, and that would be your current construction of reality. Okay, as you go and you acquire another mindset, you acquire another perceptual filter, right? Then that both of those become the new construction of reality, and that becomes your new universal perceptual filter. It integrates multiple mindsets. Okay, so the category that you have actually expands, right? So the single perceptual filter that you have would expand to contain more nuance and more information. This expansion of the mindset is what would allow the resolution of these cognitive distortions. So, again, if you are depressed, you believe that life is meaningless, you believe that you have no purpose, you see meaning in your life, you find your purpose. This expands your perception and it allows you to acquire another ego. It allows, and this expands, and then you have, and integrates, and then you have a new singular perceptual filter that allows you to look at things in a different way. And this is why you can, go through cognitive behavioral therapy, acquire a new mindset, and then you need to go back and address different aspects of your life that have resulted from the way that you perceive things, right? So the expansion of perception outside of distortion is exactly what resolves the distortion. So finding ways to move outside of your current perspective, your current construction of reality. This is kind of what I read another book, Method of Levels by Timothy Carey, and the whole idea is you want to ask questions that go up a set of categories where you are trying to control something. Now, I think this is kind of limiting in the sense that it limits everything to desires rather than experiences, and the distortions would then be what you are trying to control. But I don't necessarily think that applies to everything, right? And so, if you're asking questions that create new categories that allow you to move up the existing categories, and if you think about it, this is how therapy actually works, right? Someone comes in, they're like, I have a problem. Why do you have this problem? And you move up the categories until you arrive at the cognitive distortion that exists at the top of them. And once you resolve that, then you can move on. And the fact of the matter is, you end up going through many cognitive distortions as you do this. But if we can kind of cut through all of that to identify the core distortion, what exists at the universal perceptual filter, then everything kind of falls down below it like a domino effect type of deal, right? So characterization through symptoms of is a limitation of improvement, right? And characterization through the mindset allows expansion of perception because you can take that mindset, you can say, this mindset is limiting you, let's move to a different one, rather than just like constantly trying to move up the categories. Now, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't be moving up through the categories, but this would imply that you would want to introduce a new mindset in one way or another. And again, this is generally how it works, and with therapy, and this is why it's so important to look at things from this perspective because it reframes the way that we, not necessarily the way that we approach it, but the way that we think about how we're approaching it, right? So this would imply that cognitive distortions are not limited to existing ones as well. So there would be thousands of cognitive distortions that could exist at any point. Believing that you are bad at math would be a cognitive distortion if it is not true. But that. And even if it is true, believing that you are bad at math actually limits you, right? So you want to have this is kind of where the growth mindset comes in too, right? You want to believe I can improve at math rather than believing you are bad at math. You want to believe I can improve at math, I can be better at math, right? It wouldn't be difficult for me to start learning and start expanding my perception of how good I am at math, right? And again, that's a very small scale example, but for very deeply rooted cognitive distortions, specifically around things like depression, and more importantly treatment resistant depression, right? We can start to allow the creation of new mindsets and expanding that perception, right? So the more that you understand of your mindset, the easier it becomes to resolve these distortions. So uh, that's kind of the idea that I have here. And this explains construction of reality again, from a little bit of a different perspective than I explained it previously. It's a more direct way of explaining my ideas and exactly how I came about them. Okay, so and I believe that this is incredibly important to share and to integrate into the way that we currently see a consciousness and the way that the mind works. Um, so anyway, if you made it through this video, thank you for watching. I really appreciate you. And I hope you stick around because I have a lot more videos. I want to explain some other cognitive distortions that I created. I created personality types based off of cognitive distortions. And I plan on making a video going into more detail. About that, I plan going into more detail about how we can approach therapy from a little bit of a different perspective. I plan on going into a bunch of different details and expanding the theory itself as I do so. Okay, so I hope you all stick around, and I'm also going to be making more anime videos and chess videos and stuff eventually. But I'm in more of an intellectual mood recently, I suppose. So that's why you're getting this video. Anyway, oh yeah, I totally forgot to mention, guys. One more thing. Okay, this is actually what I based the course that I created on, that guides you through how to move through the categories for yourself. So if that's something that interests you, I'll have the link down in the description below. So you can go check that out. Okay, because I do think it's truly valuable to learn how to look within and discover these different categories and these different mindsets. So yeah, uh, there you go. Anyway, that's actually the end now. But I'm not gonna. But I already closed it out. I already did the outro. But now I'm doing another outro because I wanted to add that on there. Plug in the course a little bit. Anyway, okay. Now that's it. Thank you for watching. See you later.